I want to encourage you to study the scripture we give you at the end of each session in preparation for the following week. I know that this study can seem daunting at times, but I encourage you to stick with it and finish strong. I think you'll find it was well worth it.
Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to session 7. Today it's just Carl and myself, Howard. Joey had some things he had to do, so it's just going to be the two of us today. All right, so our emphasis today is going to be on how covenant can be extended to family, can be extended to our offspring. And we're going to talk about Jonathan's son, Mephibosheth. I've been practicing that all week. I think I'm going to get it. Carl, can you open us with some prayer?
Sure. Lord, we thank you for this time. We thank you for the riches of your word, the truth and the life that it gives to us as an example. We thank you for the positive things that are spoken. We thank you for the negative things that are brought out, that you might cause us to conquer them, that you might cause us to rise above them. We receive your word with gladness today, Father. Help us to hear it as you have spoken it. We thank you for it in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Lord. All right, so I'm going to do a little review. I'm just going to list out some things instead of making Carl try to recite them. For him, trying to get Carl to read my mind. But a little bit of review. A covenant is a serious agreement. It's a binding agreement, and it often speaks of oneness. And some of the possible symbolic acts of covenant are the exchanging of robes or identities, represents the two becoming one and dying to self. Also, exchanging weapons, and that's taking on one another's enemies, protection. And exchanging belts, or we said it's like exchanging strength, because the belt holds everything in place. And also sharing names and sharing possessions are all things that we've seen in covenant. So concerning the Abrahamic covenant, what did we learn in Genesis 12:2? Carl?
Genesis 12:2, Abraham covenant, that God would bring the descendants, promised descendants to Abraham, making them a great nation that would be a blessing to all the earth. He also promised them that they would give them land that they could develop and be as a possession for them, and then they would have a place that, to call their own, and then he would grow them into a great nation. Right. And from that nation would come the one that would be the blessing to all the earth, which ends up being Jesus.
Amen. So Lord promised Abraham that he would become a great nation, right? Yeah. And that they would be a blessing to the rest of the world, right? At the time, we need to realize that Abraham had no children, and he was probably around 75 years old, and his wife was barren. That's just something to keep in mind as we look at that. Okay, Genesis 15:3-4. And Abraham said, "Since you have given no offspring to me, one born in my house is my heir." Then behold, the word of the Lord came to him, saying, "This man will not be your heir, but one who will come forth from your own body. He shall be your heir." So God was telling him, no, even though you're in this situation, you're going to have children. And it's going to come from your own loins. It's going to be your own child. So according to Genesis 17:9-11, what was the sign of the covenant?
The Abrahamic covenant would be the circumcision of all the males born into the family, and even the males that were either servants or slaves, hate to use the term,
Yeah.
but that's what they were. Anyone that was related to that family, any male, had to be circumcised to be part of that covenant so they could be beneficiaries of the blessing of the covenant.
Right.
Yeah.
Um,
And
absolutely.
that was the memorial or the sign of the covenant, the Abrahamic covenant with the circumcision. Very, very clear sign and a very clear reminder always to them that they are part of that covenant with God.
Right. Right. I was attracted to the chapter or verse 9 says, "You shall keep my covenant." Lord speaking to Abram, "You and your descendants after you throughout their generations." So he was not only uh, putting it on Abraham to keep the covenant, but he was telling him also, your generations all need to keep the covenant too.
Yeah.
You know, all your children, they need to. It needs to continue for every generation. They need to keep this covenant. They need to do the same thing. And every male among you shall be circumcised, as you said, and circumcised in the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you. So, did you ever wonder why God chose this to be the sign of the covenant?
I always did wonder about it, but something was brought out a little. I don't know if it was last week or the week before that I never thought of it, but it's the sign because the seed has to pass through that area for the next generation, the perpetuation of generation. It has to pass, so it's almost like it's going through the sign of the covenant,
Right.
in reproduction to and I just it just like connected with me that's what before I thought it's strange at first why this particular marking or
Right.
this particular place on the body in it. But then that started making sense. That is the source of the next generation
Yeah.
coming forth. The reproduction and the reproducing of the next generation is passing through that mark, so
Right.
to speak, through the mark of the covenant right there. Going on to in the process of reproduction and that.
Well, because 17:10 says this covenant's between me and all your descendants.
Right.
So basically, you're right. I believe it's because the that's closest area to where reproduction
Right.
happens.
Right.
And without the female is a part of it too, but without the male seed, there is no child. There is no reproduction. So I mean, even today they do artificial insemination, those types of things, but still, you have to have the male seed to have the reproduction. All right, so
Yeah,
we
but that actually was like a real like dawning of an understanding about that
right,
because I've thought about that a lot and I never came up with anything. I mean, but just something that was stated just made perfect sense, and I thought, wow, the wisdom of God is sometimes right before us, and like we really miss it,
right,
because I was really always, and I even understood the aspects of like circumcision. There's like a hygienic aspect and there's like a sensitivity aspect
hmm
of it, and I was always trying to relate them to how our heart being circumcised, our heart needs to be sensitized to God.
hmm
Our heart has to be pure and clean.
right,
Our heart has to be more feeling to sense it and understand his ways in that. And I was understanding it to my heart, but I didn't understand it, to our reproductive organs and that. But then that made perfect sense that way. Just the continuation of the legacy of the covenant to each
right,
progressive generation and that it all had to be passed through that, through the sign of the covenant. It continued through the sign of the covenant.
yep. And we could, it would be real easy to jump off into a rabbit trail here about Abraham and his son Isaac and how he trusted God when God asked him to sacrifice Isaac
Yeah.
because he had a promise of a seed that was going, and Abraham, he knew God was good for the covenant, that he would keep covenant. And, I believe he knew that God wasn't going to cut off the descendants. So he knew that God, I think, he felt like, well, either God's going to provide something else or God's going to raise him from the dead,
Yeah.
because, he promised that it would be a seed through me. There would be a great nation.
Yeah.
So anyhow, let's not go down that rabbit trail. Read that statement that I gave you, that first one.
In the new paper?
Yeah.
Okay. Where does it start up the top here?
Yeah.
Okay, when a covenant was to be made between families so that the descendants of the covenanting parties were included in the covenant, then the covenant cut was made close to the source of paternity. This was in Clay Trumbull's book.
Yeah.
The blood covenant of friendship shall be consummated by your giving to me of your personal blood at the very source of paternity, under your girdle, thereby pledging yourself to me and pledging also to me those who shall come after you in the line of natural descent. When a Jewish child is circumcised, it is commonly said to him that he is caused to enter into the covenant of Abraham, and his godfather or sponsor is called Baal Beris, master of the covenant. That's also from Clay Trumbull's book.
So understanding Genesis 17 helps us understand Exodus 4, 18 through 26. Right? In light of the covenant between families and the fact that Moses was a descendant of Abraham and was about to deliver Israel from the bondage of Pharaoh, why do you think he was in danger? Well, what we read in 4, 18 through 26.
Well, I think he had an understanding of what was required, but he failed to do it for whatever reason. He failed to circumcise his own son, and even before that, when God told him what the consequences to Pharaoh would be for not obeying and not letting him go, and he even promised like death to his own child. I think in a way that was understanding. God was saying, I warned, you knew what was required, and I even warned you what was going to be required of Pharaoh if he didn't obey. And you still did not obey
Right.
me to circumcise your own child.
Right.
So
Well, he was a descendant of Abraham, right?
Right.
What did we just read when God made the covenant with Abraham? He said, you shall keep my covenant and all of your descendants.
Right.
And Moses was a descendant of Abraham.
Yeah, so Moses' responsibility was to make sure his child was circumcised,
He kept the covenant.
to keep covenant with them. And so even the implications of what he showed, he was warned and he understood it, and he was shown what Pharaoh's consequences would be, and he still failed to do it. He still failed to comply.
Right.
So, in whatever way his wife was interjected into the story, she might have had a revelation that this has to be done, So if you're not going to do it, I'm going to do it. So the covenant promise and the covenant pledge will be carried out,
Well, yeah, and like you say, if he didn't do it, would his son be protected?
No, he'd be in breach of covenant.
So his son would be, probably die. The firstborn son would probably die. So her knowing that, wanting to save her son, I believe that's why she did the circumcision and threw it at his feet. And actually, literally there, it means it fell on his foot.
Yeah.
It touched his foot.
What do you think it was caused Moses not to do that? What?
Well, I think that he was so far removed from the Jews and the Hebrews and the people there, and he was married to a woman who was not a Hebrew, and so I think he just he didn't. I don't know that he. Well, I think he should have known what was required of him, but I don't know that he thought that it was necessary because of his situation.
Mm.
You know, I don't know. I mean, what do you think?
I don't know. It was a grievous oversight for
Right,
him not to
it
do it. I
was.
don't know. Maybe there was an assumption that it didn't apply to him for some reason,
Right.
since he was this
So
called to
far
do
away,
these
yeah.
great things and all that, and he had been away from it. I think that's a good point you said about he had been away from
Yeah,
first he was trained in the ways of Egypt and that,
right,
and then he was away in the desert so long, so he had been away from actual the Hebrew life and what they would have been doing, they probably carrying that thing, carrying it out even when they were in bondage and that they probably kept.
so during COVID, when we haven't been in church, are we still responsible?
Oh, certainly, certainly. We,
That just came to my mind as you
yeah,
were talking.
no,
Yeah, yeah. All
no,
right.
all the requirements are still intact. We need to make the environment, whether it be in our own home or, a small group or something, we
Right,
have to make the environment to carry out, to continue in the faith and to
right,
continue into what God commands us to do.
right. Well, one of the things I thought about too is that Moses, he was being called by God to go and free the people, basically. So he was going into a dangerous place, and he had not kept the covenant by circumcising his sons. Do you think that Moses needed God's protection as he went back to Egypt and uh, was going in front of Pharaoh? And do you think he would have had God's protection being a covenant breaker?
No, no, it would have been in all ways it was detrimental for him to not do that,
Yeah,
so it was good that his wife,
so he needed to keep covenant.
right.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, because I mean, he was going into a situation where he was going to need God's protection.
so yeah.
Yeah, but he would not have it if he was a covenant breaker, and neither would his sons or son. I don't know how many of them there were, but I think it maybe just one son. I can't really remember how the story goes out. All right, so the terms of the covenant said a breaker would be cut off. How could he lead God's people? Because he was sending them in to lead God's people.
Mhm.
How could he be a leader of God's people if he was a covenant breaker? Because a covenant breaker will be cut off from the people.
Yeah,
That's what it says.
yeah.
So there's a lot of reasons why he had to come into, he had to come into the covenant and uh, begin to perform the things that he was called to perform.
Mhm.
Mm. So
Well, you think that all during the time in Egypt and bondage and that they were keeping the tradition of going, they're born into the family and that
oh
those
yeah,
children were circumcised.
I
They
believe
were
that's how Pharaoh's daughter knew that Moses was a Hebrew,
okay,
because
yeah,
it had to be done on the eighth day.
yeah.
And so he was a couple months old when she found him in the reeds, and she said, "This is a Hebrew child."
Yeah, that doesn't come out in Ten Commandments.
Right.
It was the cloth that clued her in that he was Hebrew, but it doesn't get. That's true. That's true.
Yeah,
Mhm.
that's what I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, I believe that he was circumcised, so she knew he was a Hebrew child.
So that was so that someone, I guess I guess the fathers being like the priest of the house, even though there wasn't like services, being done, the father was the priest of the house,
Oh
and
yeah,
so he
yeah,
did he carried out and making sure that his children were circumcised when they came into the
yeah,
family, and that,
yeah.
which is probably the way that God could protect them and deliver them because they kept covenant as
It
best
said
as they could.
it said when Abraham made the covenant with God, you know that was at that day he started circumcising all the males
Yeah.
in his household.
Yeah.
They were, of course, many of them were more than 8 days old, but
Yeah.
Yeah, he started circumcised everybody. All right, so we talked about the covenant between Jonathan and David, and in 1 Samuel 20, we saw that they extended their covenant to family, right? And after all, words Saul became jealous of David and kept trying to kill him. Yet David, even when given the opportunity, wouldn't take Saul's life. Why did David refuse to kill Saul? I'm sorry.
He says he will not touch the Lord's anointed. He honored the choice that God made, regardless of how Saul responded or how Saul carried out his life. He honored the choice that God made because he knew that God had anointed Saul to be the king. And even after Saul was rejected and Samuel anointed David, David continued to honor. Even there was two men anointed to be king, but one failed, and so it was withdrawn from him. But David continued to honor that, even to the end. After when Saul died,
Well, David knew that he was anointed to be God. To be God's king. He knew that God had anointed him to be king. But he also knew that God had anointed Saul.
Yeah, so as long as Saul lived, he would honor
that,
and he did it amazingly.
Right. All right, so I believe that David felt that it wasn't his responsibility to remove Saul, that it was God's responsibility.
Yeah.
Yeah, it wasn't, because God put him there, God takes him out.
Yeah, I think one time when they went, one of the times they encountered Saul and he was sleeping amongst and the guy that went with Abishai, I think, but he even said to him, I wouldn't think of touching the Lord, and you shouldn't be considering touching him. And he says, because he said Saul's life will run its course. He will be judged, or he will lose his life in battle, or he will lose his life natural causes. God will let his life run its. He was almost like he's like repeating back, like vengeance is God's. God will repay Saul for his mistakes in that, but it's not my place or anybody else's place to take out the Lord's anointed.
Right. So. Exactly. That's exactly what I was just saying. Yeah. And he said to David, "Look, God's delivered him into your hands."
Yeah.
So he's trying to tell him, hey, God set this up.
Yeah.
And how many times do we have incidences like that where somebody, something happens and people say, oh, well, just take it. Apparently God gave, God set it up so you could have it, but it's not right.
Yeah. Yeah, he set it up a couple of times, like when he was in the cave, same way when he just cut off the bottom of his robe in the cave. The guy said, they're telling him,
he delivered him.
He delivered into your hands. And David would not budge on his loyalty.
Yep. I also wonder if it didn't have a little bit to do with David's covenant with Jonathan, because Saul was Jonathan's father. He was part of Jonathan's family.
Yeah.
And they extended their covenant to include their family.
Yeah, it reached backwards, to the future descendants. They reached backwards to the people that were connected, with Jonathan.
Yep, and Jonathan and his father Saul, as we see there's other places that we see in Scripture where they were actually pretty close. They were pretty tight.
Yeah.
They didn't agree on everything, but...
Yeah, Jonathan talked about that Saul would not make any moves without conferring with him or giving, maybe seeking advice or just disclosing what he intended to do. So there was a tighter bond than is imagined, but...
Yeah, people don't think about that. They think about, they think that because... Jonathan was in covenant with David, that he totally turned his back on his father, but that wasn't true. He stuck with his father.
Yeah. In a lot of ways, I don't see that David ever cut covenant with Saul, but he acted like he cut covenant by the way he honored him and the way he respected him, and that he he honored Saul in that way. But I don't see that they
I
ever.
think it was two reasons. One was because, like you said, he recognized him as God's anointed,
Yeah.
so he respected, the position. And then two, it was because of his covenant with Jonathan, and Saul being Jonathan's father, being part of Jonathan's family.
Yeah.
That's just my opinion, but that's really what I believe. And I agree with you that he really did show Saul a lot of respect,
Yeah.
and so I think it's
I
both.
think Saul almost acted as being in covenant with David by taking him when he was young, taking him into the house and away from his parents, to play, to play the
Right.
harp for him, to soothe him down and that. But just he took him in and supplied for his needs. He fed him and everything else. So there was like the principles of covenant were in operation on both of them, but I don't think they ever actually cut
No, I
covenant
don't think they
to
did.
each other.
No, I don't think so.
But it's interesting how that like spills over.
Yeah, I think that Saul took David into his household for Saul's benefit.
Right. And he had
Yeah.
as he had the right to do as a king. He
Right.
could do anything he wanted, basically. But
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. All right. So, how did Saul die in 1 Samuel chapter 31?
Well, it's interesting the account of how he actually died, and then the telling of it to David. That person placed himself into the scenario what happened, and by doing that, he lost his life over saying that he killed Saul
Why do you think he did that?
to gain favor from David, misunderstanding. He didn't understand how David was so set on not touching the Lord's anointed. So anybody that touched the Lord's anointed in David's eyes was an enemy,
Right.
enemy too. So in the account of Saul, it was just in the heat of the battle. His sons, I think, had already been killed, and he was being pursued, and somehow an arrow got in between his armor or something, and he was mortally wounded, and he didn't want to be. I think he says, "I don't want to be abused by my enemy."
Right.
So he asked for his armor bearer to kill him.
Yeah.
And the armor bearer says, "No, I won't do it." Which he had the same thing as David. I'm not going to touch the Lord's anointed. So Saul ends up killing himself, falling on his own sword. And then the armor bearer killed himself also
Right.
too. But then this other guy that came and gave the report of the battle to David said that he
I think
himself killed Saul.
I think he lied because, like you said, he would gain the favor of David.
Yeah.
Because it was a custom at that time that, whoever took over the kingdom would, Saul's death, he felt David would come into the kingdom, because you remember at that time, David had gone out, for Israel, and he won all these different battles.
Mm.
And then there was a separation where David wasn't with him anymore, but David was still fighting at different places. And I believe that this Amalekite thought that, David would take the kingdom now. And so he wanted to grab some favor with who he thought was going to be the new king.
Yeah.
And so he thought, well, if I say I killed him, then he's going to honor me, and I'm going to get something out of it because I made him the king.
Yeah.
And but that wasn't David's reaction at all. Was it?
No, just the opposite. Yeah.
Yep. So yeah, in 1 Samuel 31, it gives accurate details of how Saul died. And in 2 Samuel 1, the man claiming to have killed Saul was obviously lying to David because he thought that it would bring a blessing to him from the new king. So according to 2 Samuel 1, how did David feel about Jonathan's friendship?
Oh, I understood this before, but that line, which is, I feel, has been misconstrued to sort of pervert the relationship they have. But it talks about how distressed he was, and then he says that the relationship, David to Jonathan relationship, was very, very pleasant to me. It was wonderful and surpassing the love of women. And then people are using that to twist that to try to make it a perverted relationship.
Right.
But I got out of that, see that like covenant love is perhaps the strongest form of love we can ever experience.
Right.
And ideally in the wedding covenant, that love for our wife, maybe if we've experienced intimacy before that, the intimacy within the marriage should far exceed that, because there's purpose to it. It's meaningful. It's God ordained and God blessed. So one time I was in Africa, they asked me to share a little bit about marriage and that, and the Lord took me down that path about he allowed me to start speaking about physical intimacy and how superior it is in marriage rather than outside of marriage. It's regardless of feeling that what is involved with a husband and a wife, the intimacy that they share. It's on so many levels it's satisfying. On so many levels it's fulfilling. On so many levels it's encouragement. On many levels it's security, And if covenant love and covenant regard exceeds that, then to me that has to be the highest form of love. And maybe you could make a case for it by saying that God loved us so much, he came into covenant with us, and part of that covenant was he sent his son to die for us. So it's a love level beyond, and on so many levels, outside of actual physical enjoyment or it's just...
Well, a lot of times people confuse intimacy with sex.
Right.
That's all they think about. And so when he talks about love being better than the love of women, he doesn't say a woman, but he says women.
Right.
He's basically, I think, saying that. I don't think he's saying anything about sex. I think he's saying about the love connection, the intimacy that he found with Jonathan. He also calls him brother.
Yeah.
He says he's a brother, and I loved him, and he loved me, and his commitment to me and my commitment to him went far beyond that of just a sexual encounter with women.
Right.
It was more than that.
I feel like experienced understanding that from my father's love for me, and my love for him. And I was very involved in athletics growing up. That was basically my life. But I can honestly say I loved some of my coaches because I understood beyond making me a better athlete, they wanted me to be a good person too. And they instilled challenges just even for character, not necessarily, helping me perform better athletically, but they took interest in me. They were concerned for me. They wanted me to be a better person. They wanted me to do well in school and that. Yeah. And in that, I sensed a real regard they had for me, willingness to sow into me in that. And I can honestly say, some of my coaches, I loved them. I can unashamedly as a man can say, I loved that man for what he did for me, what he poured into me.
Yep.
And so, when reading that, I've sort of experienced it, and I have no trouble with grasping that, on a completely legitimate terms in that,
Exactly.
Men can love men. And my brothers in Christ, I love some of them, I love them deeply,
Yep.
Yeah.
All right. In 2 Samuel 4:4, what happened that David had no knowledge of?
The sort of just the background of how Mephibosheth became lame. It was like, they were as Saul had died, and they wasn't, and Jonathan also was dead, and they weren't sure about how it would go with the former kings. So I think his nurse, in haste, had picked him up. I guess they were fleeing to maybe
Right.
hide somewhere,
Yeah.
take cover somewhere, and just picking him up in that and carrying him out. I guess she stumbled or something, and he fell,
Yep.
and that's how he was injured and
Yep.
became lame.
Raymond both.
I think he was about
So,
5 years old, I believe
Right.
it was.
So yeah, and it was. But David had no knowledge of this son of Jonathan's at all.
No.
It says David didn't even know that he existed. So
And I mean, it was understood as that's the way it usually happened. But David, with the integrity he had to guard, I think eliminating Saul's family was the last thing on his mind,
Yeah.
because he honored them, and he had a confidence and a surety of God that he did not have to wipe out his enemies. God would fight for him against his
Right.
enemies, and he had a confidence in his ruling that he didn't have to destroy his enemies. God would deal with that for something.
Right. Well, that's the next place that I was going. I was, who would have been the natural successor when Saul died?
It would have been Jonathan, but Jonathan he had died in the same battle too.
Right.
So it would have been Jonathan's descendants.
Well, it would have been any descendant, starting with the closest one to Saul. Saul actually had 4 sons, so it would have been Jonathan. It would have been the oldest son first, and then would have went down the line until they ran out of sons, and then they would have started with sons of sons.
Yeah.
But any descendant of the king, starting with the closest one to him, would have been the natural successor.
Well, was all of the sons killed in battle the same
No.
time as Jonathan?
No.
Just one was
Just
left.
3.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, we read about that in our story. We read about who became king over Israel in 2 Samuel 2:10.
Ishbosheth. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and he was Saul's son.
So he was the only one left.
He was the only one left. But
Okay.
anyhow, yeah. So like you say, it was custom at that time to kill any descendant of the last king, so that they couldn't claim the throne.
Yeah.
So that's what would have happened. But like you say, I don't believe that that David had any idea of doing that. So what sons in 1 Samuel 31, 2? What were the sons that died?
Well, Jonathan, and then the other 2, I'm not sure what their names were.
Abinadab and Malchichua.
Okay.
But yeah, all three of his sons died at that battle, and Ishbosheth, Saul's son, was king over Israel, and David was king over Judah.
Yeah, just Judah. It says just Judah.
Judah.
You know what's interesting too, that Ishbosheth was sort of placed in almost like by a coup, because Abner, the general of Saul's army, pushed him into the position of that he would be in place in that. So it was almost like the military arm of Saul pushing him in. So it was almost like a coup, as we know them now. And that, but
yeah, he wanted to push him in there. Well, this wasn't part of your assignment, but I want to read 2 Samuel 2, 1 through 11. Then it came about afterwards that David inquired of the Lord, saying, Shall I go to one of the cities of Judah? And the Lord said to him, Go up. So David said, Where shall I go? Up. And he said, To Hebron. So David went up there, and his 2 wives also, Ahinoam, the Jezreelitess, and Abigail, the widow of Nabal, the Carmelite. And David brought up his men who were with him, each with his household, and they lived in the cities of Hebron. Then the men of Judah came there and anointed David king over the house of Judah. So the men of Hebron, or the men of Judah, came and anointed him as king over the house of Judah. And they told David, saying, it was the men of Jabesh Gilead who buried Saul. So it was these men who buried Saul after he was found dead. David sent messengers to the men of Jabesh Gilead and said to them, may you be blessed of the Lord, because you have shown this kindness to Saul your Lord, and have buried him. Now may the Lord show loving kindness and truth to you, and I also will show this goodness to you, because you have done this thing. Now therefore, let your hands be strong and be valiant, for Saul your Lord is dead, and also the house of Judah has anointed me king over them. But Abner, the son of Ner, commander of Saul's army, had taken Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, and brought him over to Mahanaim. He made him king over Gilead, over the Asherites, over Jezreel, over Ephraim, over Benjamin, even over all Israel. Ishbosheth, Saul's son, was 40 years old when he became king over Israel, and he was king for 2 years. The house of Judah, however, followed David. The time that David was king in Hebron over the house of Judah was 7 years and 6 months. So David showed kindness to the men who had buried Saul. David became king over Judah in Hebron for 7.5 years, but Saul's son Ishbosheth was king over Israel for 2 years. I just wanted to read that. I just wanted to bring out that even these men who buried Saul, David showed kindness to them because they treated Saul with respect, because he was the anointed of God.
I guess, is it like, you think about like why God said that David was after his own heart, but it's like, it wasn't his courage, it wasn't his might, it was like his loyalty. When David was bound to someone or something, or David's heart was, he'd do it even beyond death.
Right.
It was the honor and the loyalty and the regard for that person was beyond death. He just continued it, and to his descendants, forward and backward.
Right.
He was just so, the integrity he had to keep a bond of unity, or a bond of loyalty to somebody, was amazing. And I guess like even despite his failings, David's failings, and that, God knew his heart, and even
Right.
though he was a man of blood, and that still someone that could so easily kill and slaughter still had a tenderness of heart that God saw, that God knew that about him.
Right.
He knew him so intimately that he could say that, this guy's after my heart. This guy
Right.
is made out of the stuff that I would hope, everybody would be made out of,
Right.
And how David developed that, perhaps, a lot of people say, all the time being out in the field, and just having quietness with God,
Right.
and seeing God, deliver him, and God answer requests, and God being faithful, and that he developed that, or it's, maybe it was just, partially born into him,
So we read, what was it? 2 Samuel 3:1. What was the condition of the two kingdoms at that time?
House of David and the house of Saul were always in battle, but the house of David grew stronger and stronger, and the house of Saul grew weaker and weaker. So it was just the diminishing, the falling away of any regard or any hopes, other forces had of regaining the kingdom for Saul, or in any way. It was just David was just continually over, taking it over and becoming,
Stronger and stronger.
stronger, and exactly what God intended that he would
Right.
be, that, the king over all of Israel.
Yes, exactly. So in 2 Samuel 4, 1 and 15, 5 through 12, how did Ishbosheth die?
That's just the two people came into his household, supposedly coming for any other reason, and they just again felt that they were doing service to David by killing him. And it was just the opposite,
Right.
David even called Ishbosheth a righteous man.
Yeah.
How shall you enter into a man's house, a righteous man's house, and take his life, within
Right.
within his own, within his own bed chambers and stuff like that. So David still had regard for the descendants of Saul,
Yeah, I don't know if you've read enough of the chapter or not, enough of that chapter. You find out that um, Ishbosheth got worried uh, when some things were happening because he was getting weaker and David was getting stronger. There were some things that happened, and Ishbosheth got wind of some things that happened, and he became worried and locked himself up in the house. And that's when these guys came and assassinated him.
Yeah.
It was the same time when Mephibosheth got crippled. It was when it was all this was happening at the same time.
Okay.
When she got scared too. He
Yeah.
got scared, she got scared, and went running and hiding. So I just thought that was pretty interesting. So when he was murdered, like you said, David had the guys who murdered him strung up too. He killed them for what they did because he said, how do you go into a righteous man's house? Do you think this had anything to do with his covenant with Jonathan?
Oh yeah, just being his brother, understanding, that was one of, Jonathan's brothers, and it doesn't say much about the Ishbosheth might have been a good ruler. He might have
Yeah.
been just. He might not have been like cut from the same cloth as
Right.
Saul was. It doesn't. I don't know if it completely states that, and I don't know. He was placed in the position by Abner. Maybe he felt, pressure. 'Cause
Right.
he even said once Abner died, then that's when he started being nervous, not
Right.
knowing how, because he might have been doing that. Abner might have been a very strong influence
Oh,
on
yeah.
him,
I'm sure he was.
as being faithful to Saul, being his general. He wanted sort of perpetuate Saul's kingdom,
Right.
not knowing the ramifications of that. It's out of God's order that David was to be.
Yeah.
It's just one of those twists you don't completely understand. But like Ishbosheth, why was he not on the battlefield to be killed with his other brothers? Because he had a purpose in God's plan. He was one of the pieces that God wanted to fulfill the covenant in there.
Right.
And it was just it was a delay long enough for David to truly gain gain more favor of the people, so that when he was to be anointed over king over all of Israel, the people were pretty much for it. They
Right.
had enough of the past, and they were for a change now. And so David maybe had
And they seen the integrity.
Right.
There's one example, another, how David he wasn't going to usurp authority. He was waiting for God to put him into place, into authority, and waiting for God to take out the ones who needed to be taken out in order for him to be in that position.
Right.
He wasn't taking it himself.
Yeah.
And I think the people, they appreciated that. They saw that and saw that he was a man after God's own heart.
Yeah.
Made a difference. All right, so your assignment was to read 2 Samuel 5:3, but to put it in context, I want us to read 1 through 5. Then all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, Behold, we are your bone and your flesh. Previously, when Saul was king over us, you were the one who led Israel out and in. And the Lord said to you, you will shepherd my people Israel, and you will be a ruler over Israel. So all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and King David made a covenant with them before the Lord at Hebron. Then they anointed David king over Israel. David was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned 40 years. At Hebron he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months, and in Jerusalem he reigned 33 years over all Israel and Judah. So I just wanted to read that all because first of all, they recognized, they said, and the Lord said to you, you will shepherd my people Israel, and you will be a ruler over Israel. So the people knew that God had anointed David to be their ruler, to be their king. And they recognized it. And then, our scripture in our lesson was to read 3. So all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and King David made a covenant with them.
Yeah.
I thought that was pretty awesome. Before the Lord at Hebron, and they anointed David king over Israel. So that just, I thought that was significant that Israel recognized, the people recognized that God had anointed him to be king, to be a ruler. And they said at the beginning, it says all the tribes of Israel came and spoke to him and said, when Saul was in control, you led Israel in, you led Israel out, out and in. So, he was the leader of the armies, and they prospered under his direction, and hadn't prospered since. However, once he took over Judah, Judah began to prosper.
Yeah.
And
Actually, the third time he was anointed,
Right.
Samuel was the first when he was amongst his brothers, and then
Right.
when he was king just over Judah, the Hebron, they anointed him there. Now he's finally anointed as over all of Israel,
Right.
finally fulfilling the promise, that God had made, a long time ago. And then in on his part, making covenant with them is just like, fulfilling, consummating it almost, the word and the promise of God. And David took it to heart and says, I'm going to
He made a promise
I'm
to the
pledging
people.
myself to
Yeah.
carry this role out that you
Right.
promised to me. I'm promising to carry it out what you promised to me.
Read 2 Samuel 5, verse 12.
So David knew that the Lord had established him as king over Israel, and that he had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people Israel.
So David realized that God established him as king. And the purpose that God established him as king was for the sake of the people.
Yeah.
It was for the good of the people. So he recognized that he was there to serve the people, to make things good for them. That's why God was exalting him. That's why God was taking care of him, because he knew that he would take care of the people.
Right.
I just thought that was pretty neat. So do you remember what Jonathan covenanted with David in 1 Samuel 20:15?
It was almost like renewing the covenant. We will be faithful to each other, but I'm asking you to be faithful to my descendants.
Right.
It's almost renewed the covenant that it would include his descendants, that everyone from Johnson's household, like forever
Forever,
would
yeah.
be cared for or protected by David. So they renewed. It was like almost like a second covenant, but it included.
Yeah, it wasn't really a second covenant, but it was an extension. Yeah, extension of the covenant. Yeah. I thought it interesting in that verse where it says, forever, over my house forever, not even when the Lord cuts off every one of your enemies of David from the face of the earth.
Yeah.
And what were we just reading?
Yeah. He finally had his enemies world.
Yeah, he was the king of Israel. When the Lord cuts off all your enemies from the face of the earth.
Yeah. Yeah,
that's what David waited for.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Jonathan understood it, and he says that once that happens, that you will not cut off your kindness for my house forever. Just
Yep.
closing it, that he making it that once you have arrived, you won't forget. And I get it. I think it was pretty by now that covenant that they had cut long time ago, that they both understood that they both were going to keep it. Jonathan was gone now, but he made it before once he was died. But David was even up to Saul, even Ishbosheth. It proved that David was going to keep covenant, with Jonathan, and
David
even
remembered
extend the
Yeah.
extension of the family. Both, he's going to honor that.
So that brings us up to 2 Samuel chapter 9 that we read. In your own words, tell me how this chapter relates to covenant. Remembering it, Mephibosheth had been hiding and living in poverty, basically. So, how did that chapter to you relate to covenant? What we've studied in covenant.
Well, it's just keeping the covenant pledge to be the supplier and the supporter and the protector of everyone that's involved in the covenant, and this, in this part of it, it's Jonathan's descendants. So him taking, just by the example, what he did, he took Mephibosheth into his house. He had him sit at his table. He was his protector, his supplier, her provider, just all the principles of covenant. David.
Right. First, though, he sought him out, right?
Yeah.
He didn't even know he existed until.
Right. Yeah, for Jonathan's sake, if there anybody left that I can show, anybody living left that I can show kindness to, for Jonathan's sake, almost like as a memorial to Jonathan, if he has descendants, I want to be in covenant with them. I want to be their blesser, their provider, their supporter, their protector. So he sought them out, and
And what did he do for Mephibosheth? Other than bring him in, he brought him in.
He gave him all Saul's lands and property, just all the possessions of Saul. He
Everything that belonged to them, he gave it. Everything that belonged to them, he gave it to him.
Yeah, he gave it as the living
because
heir.
Remember, everything that was Jonathan's was David's, and everything that was David's was Jonathan's.
Right. I was in the reading. It talked about Ziba, which was like the head servant in it might have been he had a role in Saul's house, but then he was in Jonathan, and then he was in Mephibosheth also.
Yeah,
that he watched over.
Him, yeah.
And then one time it talks about Mephibosheth saying that he would give everything to Ziba, and I wondered, was there anything about Ziba might been like the next heir, like the oldest in family, if it wasn't for the other true descendants of Saul, that Ziba might have been the one that would have inherited those things? I mean, I didn't see. I didn't in reading.
I mean, I don't know where Ziba where he came into the whole story, other than he came in with Mephibosheth. He was
Yeah, 'cause
helping to serve him.
right, David told him he wants you and your sons and your servants. I want you to work his
Right.
fields and watch over his property and that. But later on, it talks about Mephibosheth sort of saying, "I'm so well taken care of," and that like
Right.
he's almost saying, "Why don't you?" just keep the land that you've been working and keep the property in that because I'm at the king's table and I'm protected by the king. So I was just wondering if it was just regard for a servant that he had, or there was more to
Right.
it. Did Ziba have any cultural right to those things?
Yeah, I don't know that he would because I think it also says that Mephibosheth had a son.
Yeah,
Yeah, so those things would have went
went
his
to the
son.
son.
But yeah, it might have just been that he was going to give him a gift.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So he also showed Mephibosheth kindness and gave him the right to eat at his own table. Do you see any parallel between you and Mephibosheth that can be applied to your life because of your covenant with Jesus Christ?
Oh, from he who was rich became poor that we through his poverty may be made rich. All the blessings that's accomplished through Christ in his crucifixion and resurrection, all those accomplishments, not necessarily monetarily, but all the blessings and all the provision and all the strengthening, all the ability to be made and fashioned into his likeness, is we inherited all those things, through Christ. We gained all those things, plus the blessing of provision in that, and plus
Yeah.
the blessing to make wealth. As long as the only requirement is that we return the tithe to Him, and that as we have opportunity to be a blessing to other people, to supply need as we have the opportunity to do it.
Yeah. Well, that's the things I wrote down. I said, because of my covenant with Jesus, I can sit at the king's table,
Right.
which he's going to provide for me. And because of my covenant with Jesus, I need to seek ways to bless his children,
Yeah. Yes.
his family. I need to seek ways to bless his children and his family.
Just exactly what David did. Mephibosheth.
Mephibosheth. But I practice it all week. I still mess it up. So
It's more daunting when you look at it on the page.
right. So we might be record time this week. We're getting done here. So my rhetorical question for the week is, and we just pretty much answered it, but how can we apply these truths to our life? So just need to think about that and work on it this week, next week, the week after,
Yeah.
and the week after that. So next week we're going to take a closer look at the Abrahamic covenant and the law, or also known as the Old Covenant. You want to read that statement that the second statement on that paper that I gave you?
Let's see.
I was going to make Joey read one.
This one here?
Yeah, the whole thing.
Okay, even down to the covenants?
Yep.
Okay. Having looked at covenants God made with man, and having studied the various customs of cutting covenant, we will now turn in our study to the three covenants God used to bring us to faith in Jesus Christ: the Abrahamic, the Old Covenant, and the New Covenant. All the following facts, which are an overview of the next 2 weeks' work, will come to light as we study the scriptures, but you need to have them now as a point of reference and for the sake of continuity. The following is a simple order of events and facts regarding the three covenants. The Abrahamic covenant. God made a covenant with Abraham, promising him primarily two things: a seed and a land. This Abrahamic covenant was also ratified with Isaac, Jacob, and his sons. The Old Covenant, or the law. 430 years later, God made a covenant of law with the nation of Israel. Moses was the mediator of that covenant. God spoke to Moses. Moses spoke to the people. The old covenant, or the law, centered about the tabernacle. The earthly tabernacle was built under Moses' direction after the pattern of God's heavenly tabernacle. Therefore, the tabernacle served as an integral part of the Old Covenant. What the earthly tabernacle was to the Old Covenant, the true tabernacle in heaven is to the New Covenant. New Covenant, or grace. Through Jeremiah the prophet, God promised the New Covenant. Jesus was the mediator of the New Covenant, a better covenant than the law. When the New Covenant was inaugurated by Jesus Christ, the Old Covenant became obsolete.
So, note what God promised to who and for how long. Genesis 12, 1 through 9. Genesis 15, 5 through 21. Galatians 3, 16. Genesis 28, 1 through 22. Genesis 49, 1 through 28. Genesis 15, 13. Read Exodus 1, 8 through 14. What was Israel's condition? And Exodus 2, 23 through 25. What moved God and why? Exodus 6, 4 and 8. Exodus 24, 1 through 18. Who, what, when, why, where, and how. And finally, Exodus 25, 1 through 22. So we'll see you all next week. Happy hunting.